Hello, everyone. My name is Ava. I'm 20 years old and live in a happy family now, with my father, Thomas, and my stepmother, Claire. I also have a brother, a stepbrother, who my stepmother brought home when she married my father. His name is Ethan. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end and like the video because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. Life with my new family started out great. I didn't think much about it at first, just trying to settle into the new routine. At that time, it all felt seamless. My father remarried, but I'd always wanted a family where I could feel the warmth and support I had missed. And I got that in abundance. My stepmother was kind and caring. Ethan was easy to get along with. He helped me with everything, whether it was schoolwork or random chores around the house. I had the impression that everything was falling into place. Looking back, those first days were blissful. The whole family was kind, and my new stepbrother was thoughtful and never once made me feel strange or out of place. I remember how we would have breakfast together every morning. Claire would prepare the food, a lot of fresh, hearty meals, and Thomas would always sit next to me. He would ask how my day went, even if it was just about small things. He genuinely cared. And Ethan, he was always there, always paying attention to whatever I needed. It never felt like I had a new family. It felt like I had gained an extra layer of warmth, an extra set of people who genuinely cared. The atmosphere was peaceful and comforting. At night, we would sometimes watch movies together or just talk about random things. There were no heavy burdens, no conflicts, no awkwardness. The conversations were easy, just simple talks about how our day went. I never imagined that something as simple as a bathroom door would change everything. I remember that day like it was yesterday. It was an ordinary afternoon. I had gone to the bathroom as I usually did, with no thoughts in mind except finishing my routine. In my hurry, I forgot to lock the bathroom door, something I did often when I was in a rush. I thought nothing of it. I had been living with them for weeks now, and nothing unusual had ever happened. So when I was showering, I never thought for a moment that Ethan might walk in. But that day was different. I was startled when I heard the faintest creak of the door. It wasn't unusual for someone to pass by, but then it opened slightly more. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around quickly, but before I could even process what was happening, the door opened wider. Standing in front of me was Ethan, his face locked in an expression I didn't recognize. His usual warm, familiar gaze was gone. His eyes were cold, distant, almost as if he had just walked into an unexpected, awkward situation. I immediately froze. There was a moment of silence, one that felt much longer than it actually was. He quickly turned away, but not before I saw that look in his eyes. It was a mix of shock, confusion, and something else that I couldn't quite place. For a few seconds, I was paralyzed. I wanted to say something, but nothing came out. And then, in a daze, I finished what I was doing and quickly got out of the bathroom, feeling strange. A feeling of unease settled in my chest. That feeling didn't go away. I spent the next few days trying to figure out what had happened. What had changed? Was there something between us that I hadn't noticed? Or had Ethan been hiding something? Every time I tried to shake it off, the feeling lingered, a gnawing sense that something wasn't right. But at first, the changes were so subtle, so small. He still talked to me, but there was a difference now. A shift I couldn't identify. Ethan was still there, helping me as always, but his eyes, his gaze, felt distant. The warmth was gone. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things. I kept telling myself that things couldn't have changed so quickly, but they had. Every time Ethan looked at me now, there was something in his eyes. The same affection I had seen before wasn't there. Instead, it was something darker, something I couldn't understand. The change was gradual, but it was real. Sometimes his glances lingered, not with the same brotherly concern, but with something that made me feel uncomfortable. It wasn't affection anymore. It was a strange, cold intensity that I couldn't explain. It wasn't just his eyes. The way he acted changed too. Conversations became sparse. At first, we would talk about everything: life, friends, even our favorite shows. But now, every conversation was brief. He would respond to me in a distracted way, like he was trying to avoid a deeper connection. I could sense it every time we ate together when we sat down at the dinner table. The gap between us was growing. The casual warmth that used to fill the room seemed to be replaced with an uncomfortable silence. I couldn't stand it. I didn't understand what was happening. I wanted things to go back to normal, but nothing seemed to help. Ethan kept acting as though I was a stranger, and I was left wondering whether it was my fault. I tried to push these thoughts aside, convincing myself it would all go back to normal eventually. But deep inside, I knew something had changed, and that change had a way of creeping into every aspect of our interactions. Then came the night when everything changed for good. My parents were away, and I had been working on a math problem for hours. I was stuck. I didn't want to bother anyone, but the problem had become a weight on my mind. I had asked Ethan for help many times before, and he had always been patient with me. But something felt different now. He hadn't spoken to me much, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was avoiding me. The distance between us was tangible. Still, I had no choice. I needed help. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach him, but finally I stood up and walked to his room. When I reached his door, I knocked lightly. "Come in," his voice sounded from inside. I pushed open the door and stepped into his room. Ethan was sitting at his desk, absorbed in something. But as soon as I entered, he looked up at me. His face was different. No longer the familiar face I had known. It was serious, almost cold. His eyes held no warmth, no connection. But he didn't seem uncomfortable. He simply asked, "What's the matter?" I stood there, unsure of what to say, my heart racing. I took a deep breath and said, "I'm stuck on a math problem. Can you help me?" He nodded and motioned for me to sit down. We worked through the problem, but something felt off. Even though he explained everything clearly, his focus seemed to drift, as if he was avoiding me. Each time he pointed to something on the paper, I felt that invisible wall between us, as if he didn't want to get too close. There was no warmth in his voice anymore. When the problem was solved, I got up to leave. But before I could step away, Ethan suddenly grabbed my hand. My breath caught in my throat, and I looked at him in surprise. His grip was firm, but his eyes, they were different. No longer cold, but filled with something I couldn't place. We stood there for a moment, neither of us speaking. My heart raced, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from his. Something shifted in that instant. "Ethan," I whispered, barely able to speak. My voice trembled. I didn't understand what was happening. His grip tightened, and I could feel the air around us becoming thick with tension. I had no words for what I felt in that moment. His eyes were intense, searching, and not the eyes of a brother who loved his sister. These eyes held something darker, something I didn't know how to process. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan spoke, his voice low, almost like a confession. "Ava, I like you. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine. I want you to stay with me. I want us to be together." I couldn't process his words. They didn't make sense. I stared at him, disbelief clouding my mind. How could he say that? This wasn't the Ethan I knew. This wasn't my brother. My heart began to pound in my chest, and I felt a surge of panic rise inside me. "No, Ethan," I stammered, my voice breaking. "This can't be happening. You can't say that. You're my brother." But Ethan didn't seem to hear me. He continued, his voice dark and filled with a strange intensity. "Ava, every night since I saw you bathing, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. I need you with me, always." His words were like a slap in the face. I felt dizzy. This couldn't be happening. The brother I had trusted, the one who had always been so kind and caring, was now telling me this. I tried to pull my hand away, but his grip tightened. He looked at me as if I was the only person in the world. His eyes were filled with something dark, something dangerous. "Stop," I cried, trying to free myself. "You can't do this. This isn't right." But Ethan didn't let go. His eyes darkened further. "You don't understand, Ava. I need you. I can't live without you." The room felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on me. My breath quickened. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the world around me felt like it was collapsing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Finally, I managed to pull my hand free. "No, Ethan, you can't do this to me. You can't do this to us." He looked at me, stunned, as if he had just realized the magnitude of his actions. "I'm sorry, Ava. I didn't mean to scare you like this." I said nothing. I stood there, feeling numb, my entire body trembling. My heart ached. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I just wanted to escape. I turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I locked myself in my room, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion. How could this happen? How had everything gone so wrong? From that day forward, everything between Ethan and me had changed. We still lived under the same roof, but the warmth was gone. The silence between us was deafening. No more easy conversations, no more laughter at the dinner table. It was as if a wall had come up, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break it down. I couldn't look him in the eye anymore. Every time I saw him, it felt like I was standing on a cliff. One small breeze could send me crashing down. The bond we once shared had disintegrated, leaving only an empty, hollow space between us. The next days were filled with silence. It was a silence that felt suffocating, one that filled every corner of the house. Every time I walked into a room, I could feel it, thick and heavy, hanging between us like a dense fog that wouldn't lift. It was as if Ethan and I had become strangers, each of us stuck in our own world, too afraid or too hurt to break the silence. Even though we still lived together under the same roof, the warmth and familiarity that had once filled our home were gone. In its place was an unbearable tension that neither of us knew how to address. Every time I saw him, I felt my heart beat faster. The once comforting sight of Ethan now made me feel uneasy. It wasn't the same anymore. His eyes, those eyes that used to hold nothing but care and concern, were now cold and distant. They no longer spoke of affection or brotherly love, but of something that made my stomach churn. The distance between us grew with each passing day. I tried to convince myself that it would eventually pass, that maybe it was just a phase, but deep down I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. It was hard for me to face him. I kept my distance, avoiding him as much as possible. I didn't know how to talk to him anymore. How could I? How could I face the person who had once been my brother, who had now turned into someone I didn't recognize? Every time we crossed paths, I would quickly look away, too afraid to meet his gaze. I feared that if I did, I might see that same intensity in his eyes again, the one that had made my skin crawl. The worst part was the silence from my stepmother, Claire. She didn't understand. She didn't know what had happened between Ethan and me. To her, it was just a family issue, a small disagreement between siblings that would be sorted out in time. But how could I explain to her that it wasn't just a small matter? How could I tell her the truth without tearing apart the family that we had worked so hard to build? I wanted to tell her, I really did, but the words never came. How could I explain what had happened? How could I say that my brother, my stepbrother, had crossed a line that could never be undone? Whenever Claire asked me about it, I would force a smile, pretending that everything was fine. "Oh, it's just a small issue," I would say, brushing it off as if it were nothing. But inside, I was breaking. I didn't want her to know the truth. I didn't want her to see me like this, to see the pain and fear that were slowly consuming me. I had to keep up the facade for her sake. I didn't want to hurt her, but I couldn't keep lying to her forever. I kept asking myself why it had to happen like this. Why did Ethan change? What had happened between us that made everything so complicated, so twisted? It was as though the bond we once shared had been shattered in an instant, and I couldn't find a way to piece it back together. I couldn't understand what had happened. One minute, Ethan had been the caring, kind brother I had always known. The next, he was someone else entirely. I had no idea what had changed inside him, or why he had started looking at me the way he did. Had I done something wrong? Had I said something that made him think I felt the same way? No, I couldn't have. I didn't feel that way about him. I couldn't. It wasn't normal. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe it didn't matter what I felt. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. Every time I tried to move past it, every time I tried to pretend things were normal, the reality of the situation hit me all over again. The fear, the confusion, the sense of betrayal, every emotion came flooding back, and I found myself stuck in an endless loop of questions and doubts. The truth was, I couldn't forget what had happened. I couldn't erase Ethan's words, the look in his eyes, the way he had held me. How could I? How could I ever forget the moment that had shattered everything? I knew I needed to talk to someone, but who could I turn to? How could I explain this to anyone without feeling ashamed, without feeling like I was the one who had done something wrong? I had no answers. I had no way of making sense of it all. The days turned into weeks, and nothing changed. The distance between Ethan and me only grew. We went through the motions of living together, but there was no real connection. We were strangers under the same roof, trapped in a silence that neither of us knew how to break. I avoided him as much as I could, and he did the same. Our interactions were limited to the bare minimum, simple exchanges when necessary, but nothing more. Every time I thought about the future, I felt a sense of dread. How would we ever fix this? How could I go on pretending everything was okay when I knew it wasn't? There was no going back to how things were before. The bond that we had shared was gone, and no amount of time would bring it back. And then came the day when I realized I couldn't keep hiding. It was late at night, and I was lying in bed, my thoughts racing. I couldn't sleep. My mind was filled with everything that had happened. The strange looks, the awkward moments, the pain of knowing that everything had changed. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to face it. I had to confront the truth, even if it hurt. I couldn't live in this lie anymore. I needed to talk to Ethan, to finally tell him that what had happened between us was wrong. I needed to say it out loud, to make him understand that I couldn't accept it, that I couldn't just pretend it never happened. I had to tell him that I needed space, that I needed to rebuild my life, my sense of self. I couldn't live in fear, constantly wondering what would happen next. I had to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. That night, I went to his room. I stood outside the door for a long time, gathering the courage to knock. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like I was about to collapse. But I knew I couldn't turn back. I had to face him, even if it meant losing everything I thought I knew about our family. I knocked. "Come in," Ethan called from inside. I opened the door slowly, stepping into his room. He was sitting at his desk, just like the last time, but this time, there was no distance between us. I was determined to face him, to tell him everything I had been feeling, everything I had been hiding. He looked up, and for a moment, there was no warmth in his eyes, just coldness. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice neutral. I could feel the weight of the silence between us. I took a deep breath and spoke, my voice shaking but firm. "Ethan, we need to talk." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally being honest with him, with myself. "I can't keep pretending this is normal. I can't live like this anymore. I need you to understand that what you said, what you did, it wasn't okay. It wasn't just a mistake. It's changed everything." Ethan sat there frozen. For the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, regret, maybe even sadness. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know how to stop." "I know," I said softly, "but I can't go back. Things will never be the same." And they weren't. The conversation didn't fix everything. It didn't magically restore the relationship we once had, but it was a start. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was finally being heard. I didn't know where we would go from here, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to let go of the past. I had to accept that sometimes things change, and we can't always fix them, but we can learn to live with the consequences. The days after that night were incredibly difficult. Despite the conversation with Ethan, the pain didn't go away. I had told him how I felt, and I had gotten the truth out, but it didn't erase the discomfort, the betrayal that had settled deep in my heart. It was as if that one conversation, while necessary, only scratched the surface of everything that had been buried. I still felt the weight of it all. The house, once filled with laughter and easy conversations, felt cold now. There was no joy left in our gatherings, no warmth when we sat together at the table. I was constantly aware of the distance between Ethan and me, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it was always there, like an invisible wall separating us. The worst part was that Claire, my stepmother, still didn't understand. She noticed the silence between Ethan and me, but thought it was just a phase, a sibling rivalry that would eventually pass. She would sometimes ask, with concern written all over her face, why we weren't talking as much anymore. I would just smile weakly and tell her, "It's nothing, just a small thing." But the truth was that there was nothing small about it. There was a deep wound inside me that I couldn't explain. I couldn't share this with her, and the longer I kept it to myself, the more it hurt. I kept hoping that time would heal the wounds, that if we just waited long enough, everything would go back to normal. But deep inside, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Things had already shifted, and there was no undoing what had been done. Time passed, but the healing never came. I spent many sleepless nights lying in bed, replaying everything in my mind. I thought about the look in Ethan's eyes, the way his hands had gripped mine so tightly, and the words he had said, words that I could never unhear. I wondered if I had misunderstood him, if I had somehow made him feel that way. But no, I hadn't. This was not something I had caused. This was his doing. The guilt I felt from that moment lingered in my mind, even though I knew I was not at fault. I knew it was Ethan's responsibility to control his feelings, to not let them cross the line between brother and sister. And yet, the shame and confusion still haunted me. I couldn't go back to how things were, and I didn't want to pretend that I could. I had tried to be brave, to act as though everything would heal with time, but I was fooling myself. The truth was, things would never go back to how they were. There was no more innocence in our relationship, no more safety. The bond we once shared was broken, and there was nothing left but this cold, tense silence. But something inside me changed. I realized that if I continued to live in fear and confusion, I would never be able to heal. I had to face the truth, the painful truth that some relationships simply cannot be fixed. And in that moment, I made a decision. I had to let go. I couldn't keep living in this half-life, constantly looking over my shoulder, afraid of what might happen next. I couldn't pretend that everything was okay when it wasn't. I needed to find a way to move forward, to rebuild my life, and to start living for myself again. That meant distancing myself from Ethan. It meant taking a step back from the relationship that had been the source of so much pain and confusion. I couldn't continue to live in the same space with him, acting as though nothing had happened. I couldn't act like everything was fine when I was constantly reminded of the betrayal. I had to create boundaries for my own sake. It wasn't easy. There were times when I would catch a glimpse of Ethan and my heart would ache. I would remember the good times, the easy conversations, and the love we had once shared. It was hard to let go of that, to accept that it was gone forever. But I had to. For my own peace of mind, for my own healing, I had to walk away from what we had. I couldn't keep living in the past. I couldn't keep dwelling on what had happened. The past was painful, but it was over, and I had to focus on the future, on what I could control, not on the mistakes and regrets of the past. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. I knew that. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was taking control of my life again. I was no longer going to let fear and guilt dictate my actions. I was no longer going to let Ethan's mistakes haunt me. I was going to live my life the way I wanted to, without the weight of this toxic relationship holding me down. And slowly, little by little, I began to heal. It wasn't a quick fix, and it wasn't painless, but it was progress. Each day, I took a step toward healing. I focused on myself, on my happiness, on my future, on creating a life that was free from the pain and fear that had once consumed me. I spent more time with my friends, I took up new hobbies, and I slowly began to rediscover who I was outside of my family and the trauma I had experienced. And over time, I learned to forgive, not just Ethan, but also myself. I realized that I wasn't to blame for what had happened. I had done nothing wrong. The only thing I could control was how I chose to move forward. Forgiveness didn't mean I had to forget, but it meant that I was no longer going to carry the weight of the past with me. I let go of the anger and resentment that had held me hostage for so long, and in doing so, I set myself free. As for my family, everything changed. But that's the thing about life. It's constantly changing. You can't control everything, but you can control how you respond. I decided to respond with strength, with grace, and with the determination to move forward. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I had to keep moving forward no matter how hard it was. And eventually, I found peace. It wasn't the kind of peace I had expected, the kind that comes from everything being perfect. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from everything going back to normal. It was a different kind of peace, the kind that comes from accepting that life isn't perfect, and sometimes things happen that we can't change. But in accepting that, we also find the strength to move on and find happiness again. I learned that silence can destroy a relationship, but honesty can heal it. The silence between Ethan and me was never going to be repaired by pretending that everything was okay. The truth needed to come out, and once it did, I could begin to heal. I learned that silence, while often easier, only deepens the pain. Talking about the hard things, facing the truth, those are the things that set us free. And I promised myself I would never let fear control my life again. I would face whatever came next, no matter how painful it was. Because in the end, it was my life, my happiness, and I was the one who had to live it. The story ends here, but my journey is just beginning. I don't know what the future holds, but I know one thing for sure. I am stronger now than I've ever been before, and I am ready to embrace whatever comes my way. Thank you for listening to this story. If you found it moving or thought-provoking, please like and share it. And remember, no matter what you're facing, you have the strength to get through it. Keep moving forward and take life one step at a time.